Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome again to the Ready or Not podcast with Scott Woods and our co-host now.
Yay!
Maybe not permanent, but she's here, Shannon Williams Mitchum. Today I have the honor of a really important person in our broadband and community education space. I want to welcome James Neal, who is a senior program officer with the Institute of Museum and Library Services here in Washington, D.C. And before we get started, you all know how we do. This is the Ready or Not podcast, where we focus on local and community and national leaders who are actually putting in the work of local coordination, community education in communities across the country. And I am honored, we are honored, to have such a prestigious person to join us today who brings a wealth of information on community education, library science, community anchor institutions. Please welcome Mr. James Neal.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so everyone, this is season 2, episode 2, and let's get started. So I just introduced our guest and our co-host, and so I am going to turn it over to Shannon. We're going to talk about broadband community highlights and recent events this week. We'll go into a deep dive with Mr. James Neal, and then we'll do a wrap up, and then we'll count show number 2 in the book. So Shannon, I'm turning it over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Scott. Happy to be here. So we're going to try something a little bit new with the podcast. We're going to start off with some highlights from the Broadbandio Community, some of the posts that have been discussed, and get Mr. James Neal's opinion on some things, get Scott's opinions on things, and I'm just going to go do some of the top 3 discussions that we had in our broadband community. I'd love to hear their input. So the first one, Gigi's nomination hearing, right? President Biden's nomination for the open seat on the Federal Communications Commission had her hearing this week. So curious about you all's thoughts about how that went. There were some discussions about the timeline of BEAD allocations potentially being delayed due to, as you all are well aware of, some of the challenges with the FCC fabric. So curious about what you guys think about that.
So I'll start off. Mr. Neal's still employed with the federal government, so he has to be measured in his comments. But I thought it was long overdue. I thought it was overly politicized, as they all are. But again, I think she also didn't do herself any favors with a lot of her past tweets and endorsements. But I think it's time that the FCC has a commissioner, a full slate of commissioners at the FCC to deal with some of the significant issues that are in front of the commission and the country, particularly as it relates to broadband expansion, particularly in low-income and vulnerable communities across the country. So we'll be welcome without talking about the politics of it.
No, I mean, I'm happy to even dance a little bit around the politics because Gigi Sohn is someone who, when I first got interested in technology and computers and libraries, she was someone I looked to because I saw her advocacy work. And I think anytime I see a picture of the current FCC commission, it's 4 folks. Yeah. It needs to be a 5-member commission.
Absolutely.
And I think her voice will definitely be welcome and needed, and she is the person for the job. So I do hope that she is confirmed.
Yeah, I think that was the sentiment in the community. A lot of people they want that 5th commissioner. They think her views particularly align with community as opposed to industry, would bring a sort of needed view or balance to the commission. I've met her. I met her at SBLN, the Shelby, last year. Had spent some time with her. I find her to be reasoned. I understand some of the criticism and the controversy, but it really doesn't have a lot to do with her role as a commissioner on the FCC. So if that's the standard by which everyone's going to be evaluated here in DC, I think we all may be into some type of, I wouldn't say trouble, but align us to some type of controversy. But I hope she's confirmed. I hope we have that 5th commissioner.
Yes.
I hope she gets in and deals with this fiasco of mapping and some of the litany of other things that are pending in front of the commission. But our job, no matter what, is going to be to move forward, hopefully with that 5th commissioner.
All right. Speaking of that, I mean, do you think that what difference does it make, right, for the broadband community specifically, having the 4 or 5? Like, that's one thing I'd like for you guys to chime in on, like how would it affect the implementation of BEAD and some of these other
one of the things programs? I saw recently was, I'm sorry to talk over you, but one of the things I saw recently is that she tweeted out that she is firmly committed to making sure that the broadband mapping issue is done correctly, and I think she's very sincere about that. And I think that will make one of the biggest differences right off the bat. There has been a lot of discussion about, the short time frame that there was for the challenge process. I think there needs to be some things that are rethought about how anchor institutions are accounted for in the broadband mapping. So I know that Gigi is attentive to those issues and will, be a big voice for those folks in that community.
Can I follow up on that? How do you feel about anchor institutions, libraries, museums not even reflected in the map? That is a huge deficit.
I will defer to an organization that we both know and love. That's Shelby,
Yes.
Schools, Health, and Library Broadband Coalition. I do think that John Windhausen and his team have done adequate job of pushing back on why anchor institutions were not as well represented in the initial broadband mapping. Libraries also represent a very unique space. Not everyone knows where the library is in certain areas, especially that you're rural, and some of the tribal lands are also harder to find. So it's an ongoing and continuous effort to be sure that anchor institutions, including schools, health institutions, as well as libraries, are included. But libraries are definitely such a strong space for public access to computers and to ubiquitous Wi-Fi. So there's a lot there.
Absolutely, and which is why I'm glad that you're here to speak to that, because we talk a lot about broadband access and infrastructure expansion. I know Shannon has some more points that she wants to get to, but I think what's been missing in the conversation up till now, and it's the reason why we've launched this series From Advocacy to Action, is to start to talk about those nuances, talk about the role of community anchor institutions in community connectivity and community education. So again, I am so excited that you're here and we can get to dive into some of these in just a few minutes. But I'll turn it back over to Shannon. She has to turn her iPad back on.
Okay, I can't keep doing this. This is gonna have to be edited out. Sorry.
So you just have to touch it
Right.
every few seconds.
So another great event that we had in our broadband community was with Evan Feynman, who's the director of the BEAD program. We have a series called Where's the Funding, or WTF, where we have folks come in and learn about getting access to funding and capital so that they could start their deployment projects. So
I've got a funny story about that. I'm sorry to interrupt you. So WTF, we have a number of products where we just go by the acronym. One was Where's the Fiber?
Okay.
We were doing a community test in a community in, I won't say where, Newark, New Jersey.
Oh, yes.
And we got pushback from the community and community representatives that, that was vulgarity.
Just the acronym.
Just the acronym. So I have to let
offended.
people know. WT, I don't know where your mind is,
Right.
but WTF
Whiskey
stands
Tango
for
Where's the funding?
Whiskey Tango Foxtrot. Where's the fiber? Where's the funding? So for all of you who thought it meant something else, that's another YouTube channel or podcast, not this one. So go ahead, Shannon.
No,
I'm sorry.
you're fine. The perfect, great story. So the discussion centered around subrecipients of the BEAD and 25% match requirements and letter of credit requirements. And so curious if you had any insight or advice or thoughts about some of the discussions surrounding
Well,
that.
one of the things that I really like about my job at the agency I work for is a chance to have interagency collaboration and cooperation. The Department of Commerce, NTIA, is much larger than my institution. So
Really? NTIA is very small.
Well-
So when I was at NIST, it's like 3,000 people.
We're small.
NTIA, it's like 300.
200.
Not even.
100.
Just recently
we're
became
about
300.
we're about 60 to 70 folks
Wow.
at my agency.
Okay.
So but I look to them for leadership. I look for them for digging deeply into what's needed. Within the federal government, there is a tremendous amount of bureaucracy. Some of it can't be avoided. I was happening to look at some ideas around how we're going to assess and account for all of this money that's being spent right now. And I think NTIA is well within their right to include some requirements for accountability purposes.
I was impressed. I encourage everyone to log on to the Broadbandio community and watch that. We do it in partnership with the Fiber Broadband Association. I thought Evan did a really good job. I thought he was knowledgeable. He hit all the points. He was really clear that beyond the FCC's fabric map, the onus will be on states to develop additional data sets, inclusion of community anchor institutions in the challenge process and the mapping process. I think that aligns perfectly with what we do here at Ready and Broadband.money. However, I did have an issue with his answer regarding the match and letter of credit requirement and the feedback that we're getting that they'll impact local service providers, particularly minority-owned and women-owned. And he seemed to kind of throw up his hands and say, well, you know, that's kind of the outcome of how it's done, but it also runs counterintuitive to the BEAD's NOFO's inclusion or recommendation or mandate even that the states come up with reasoned processes to include participation from women and minority-owned businesses. So it seemed counterintuitive to me that you have a higher match and this really significant letter of credit that's a burden,
right? But
then at the same time, you're saying we want to include, you know, diverse, small, disadvantaged, if you will, you know, businesses in the BEAD. That actually is going to be a burden. So,
right.
Outside of that, though, I thought he did a really good job, and I encourage everyone to log on to our community and see that 30-minute segment we did with Evan Feynman.
And one of our community ambassadors did a post summarizing the 10 major takeaways from the event. So definitely join the community to hear more about that. And then last community highlight that I'd love to get your thoughts on was a post that I authored where I highlighted.
You authored a post?
I authored the post,
okay.
not the report.
Not the report. Okay.
That was this Digital Skills Coalition that talked about a study that they did. They looked at 43 million job postings and then analyzed which of those requires some form of digital skills. And so 93% of them, of course, did. And when they define digital skills as like those foundational skills such as opening email, just basic device use. And so I think it was pretty obvious, right? We know that day-to-day life, everyone needs to have some literacy of how to use a computer. So it didn't surprise me. But, you know, I'm curious about what you all think. And there's like the basic foundational skills for digital literacy, but then there's also the higher order skills that are necessary to fully participate in like the tech ecosystem that we need to start talking about more as well, because as you well know, if you only are learning those basic skills at this point, you're already way behind.
Yeah, I can speak to that. I'm a big fan of the National Skills Coalition. I think they do great work. I watched a number of their webinars over the past several years, especially during the pandemic. This recent report I just started diving into. It's interesting that you mentioned digital literacy and digital skills training. It is the one thing that we at IMLS are very adamant about. We realize that access, adoption, affordability, availability are crucial and basic and foundational to digital inclusion and digital equity. But for librarians and their communities, you have to be digitally literate and you have to have digital skills in order to be a participant in the workforce, in order to have some economic development, in order to be able to manage health and medical information, as well as the overall educational enterprise that we know that has come about through technology and online learning, virtual learning, remote learning, and the like. So the various forms of digital skills and digital literacy training is something that we want librarians to focus on, as well as imparting that information to their communities. Scott?
Absolutely. You're here. You're the expert. I can't follow that up. I think that's a great segue to talk about your role at IMLS and your professional background. If you could give our audience an overview of that. But that was a great answer. I'm not even going to try to follow that one up with my comment.
It's a trend and a current that is, fairly recent because there's been so much focus on devices and access and availability and affordability.
Mm-hmm.
But the bottom line is you have to be able to use the technology, to use the internet, to use software in order to really be successful.
And that conversation is beyond just the basics too, right? It gets into super coding and quantum physics,
privacy and
security.
Yes.
It gets into STEM and STEAM and
Exactly.
all of that, and now Meta, right? We're talking about the right. So it's not just basic skills. It includes that, but it's not just that, right? So you can be, you know, the high school student that wants to go take your STEM and coding to the next level. You're still going to need those next generation devices and skills to be able to do that. Or if you are elderly or tribal and this is your first time getting access to a tablet or a device, it includes that as well.
And then libraries are such an important interface with day-to-day residents who live in communities, right? Like everyone has a library in their community.
Depends on where you are.
Well,
right.
Maybe
there's some communities without libraries, and that's another conversation.
That's a whole nother conversation. That's another episode when we invite you back.
Okay, I sound out of touch making that. We're gonna edit that out. But
let me speak a little bit about my background.
Absolutely, please.
So, I mean, in my before I got to IMLS, I was a librarian in Prince George's County at the Hyattsville branch. Started off as a children's librarian, a youth librarian, and then became head of digital services. And in that job as a librarian in the branch, that was my first exposure to what digital inclusion could actually mean. I spent some time monitoring public access computers, having people, sign up and get a reservation, and then watching them as they did their work. And one day there was this woman who was looking increasingly frustrated, and I saw what she was doing. She was looking for a job or applying for a job to Burger King. And, those online job applications are difficult to navigate. So she calls me over. She says, "Mr. Neal, I'm applying for a job at Burger King. They want me to convert my Word document resume into a PDF. Mr. Neal, I don't even know what a PDF is." So I sat down with her, showed her the Adobe Acrobat Suite, talked to her about PDFs and why they're more secure and a little bit more useful for submitting a resume. And she came back 2 weeks later, gave me a big hug, said I got the job. So that was one moment where I saw digital inclusion and digital equity work in play. Also saw something that still troubles me, and probably one of the areas that I really think this most strongly about is the homework gap. I would see families come into the library, huddled around the public access computers with their books, with their tablets, or with their smartphones. They were interacting with the computer, and they would stay until the very end of when the library closed. And it didn't dawn on me, like, these people don't have computers at home. They may or may not have internet access at home. But there's so much work that's being given out now in schools where you have to have the internet, even for families to communicate with teachers or to know what the curriculum is all about. So that's, one of the areas in which I care most about, and I know that the chairwoman of the FCC, the Homework Gap, is a major impetus and initiative of hers as well. But at IMLS, I cover a number of ranges, including digital inclusion and digital equity, as well as open educational resources, data privacy and security, as well as ebooks and public interest and civic technology. So I am really interested in trying to assist communities around the country who are interested in those areas as they continue to be impacted by the pandemic, economic precarity, social and political upheaval. These things are all still going on, and the work of libraries is extremely important for social cohesion.
Absolutely. That's a great segue to our next question, which is IMLS's approach to local coordination, community engagements, local outreach, particularly in unserved and underserved communities. I know you've played a huge role in the development of that policy at IMLS. If you can talk to us about that approach and some of the takeaways from leading that effort.
That's one of the things that our current director at IMLS, Crosby Kemper, frequently talks about is use of language and being very specific and nuanced in how language is used. So many times when we think about who is underserved, what does it mean to be unserved, to think about some of the economic and class issues, some of the racial issues that are involved, but being able to define specific inequities and then address those inequities and try to find positive, practical, immediate, and practical solutions. That's what we're trying to do. One of the things we did at IMLS a few years ago was we created a program called Accelerating Promising Practices for Libraries. This was a program that was established to try to give a little bit more of an opportunity to smaller and rural libraries who may have not had the capacity to apply for a federal grant. And we had several cohorts in that group. One included digital inclusion and digital equity. The other was for school libraries. The other was for community memory and community archives. So what has happened now is that we were able to do 2 rounds, 2 years each for that program. And what we discovered is, by just a little bit of hand-holding, some technical assistance along the way, we were able to give them the digital confidence and the digital dignity to be able to apply for federal funding, and got some good work done in many different areas.
Can I push that just a little bit,
sure.
that notion of digital confidence? Because we don't hear a lot about that. You hear about the equity lens, you hear about the device utilization and adoption, but never the results of that, what can happen and what should happen once a community gets that digital confidence and that digital support to be able to take advantage of what we take advantage of, which is everything that we do is on some type of digital platform. Can you elaborate on that?
The first time I heard the concept of digital dignity, it came from one of my grantees, a professor at the University of Texas at Austin. Her name is Sharon Strover. She was doing research on Wi-Fi hotspot lending in rural libraries in Kansas and in Maine. And she talked to me after the grant was over about, by giving someone access to the internet, by giving them a device, that's something that is a sign of dignity, a sign of belonging. There's so many people who feel unincluded or, out of the loop. And for seniors and for people who may not be as technologically literate or who didn't have the advantage of getting some of this training in school, it is a big thing to be able to say, I follow so and so on Twitter, or I've got such.
Follow James Neal on Twitter right now. You'll learn a lot.
But that's another thing. The internet offers so much, and people don't even really begin to scratch the surface of what's there. So digital dignity. Digital confidence is something that I use personally when I talk to folks, because my father, who was very much into technology when I was a kid, but he was analog, and by the time that digital came along, he was even afraid to touch a mouse.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's one thing I wanted to ask about, or it's kind of the flip side of the coin, right? Building digital confidence, but underlying it is a fear that a lot of people have because they don't have the confidence and ability in how to use the devices, and so it's a lot hard to overcome.
Another thing that's really important, this goes back to the digital literacy and digital skills training, is that you have to have the mindset in the 21st century of learning, unlearning, relearning, and continuous learning. And in libraries we call it lifelong learning. And I think with technology and a lot of digital inclusion and digital equity initiatives, it's a continuous process. It goes on and on and on. It's never over.
It's called growth, right?
Growth.
That's how you grow, right? Grow and expand,
exactly.
Right? Not just my waistline, but actually growing and expanding our quest for knowledge.
There you
right?
go. Yeah.
So that pushes me to our next question, is the role of libraries and museums in closing the digital divide, right? You fund a lot of libraries and museums and post-secondary education, colleges and universities. So what role should libraries and museums and community anchor institutions play in closing the digital gap in communities?
That's a good question, Scott, and it's something I think about quite a bit. Just in looking back at what happened during the pandemic and even prior to the pandemic, because this work has been going on for long before the pandemic existed and long before any of this federal investment existed. There have been a couple of other injections, BTOP, and now IIJA, as well as all of the other iterations that we have. But what's interesting is that IMLS and libraries have funded some really foundational projects, including one at the beginning of the pandemic called the Digital Navigator Program. We funded the Salt Lake City Public Library with an effort within their locale, but they were able to use the networks from the Urban Libraries Council and the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, our colleagues and associates, to distribute information about that program, and found a lot of success and national impact. And now we see digital navigator programs popping up everywhere. We also funded a project with the State Library of North Carolina in 2018, pre-pandemic, related to the homework gap, where the State Library hired a digital inclusion librarian whose job was specifically to make outreach to school districts to help parents deal with that issue of how should I manage my child's curriculum and educational development that's online. Another example is a project we funded called the Gigabit Toolkit Project, which is basically a toolkit or a set of resources that has been given to libraries who need to manage their cyber infrastructure as well as their broadband and broadband access and Wi-Fi networks. So that's been a really strong program in that it's part of what we call our National Digital Infrastructures and Initiatives Program, which means we like to see open source, shared resources that can be shared and improved upon, mixed up and made better. So that project has done really well as well. I think that's the major thrust, the Gigabit Toolkit, digital.
That's it.
I was about to say, how much?
Fantastic programs.
What's your budget every year? Why is it highlighted more?
Well, we're a small agency. We're what they call a petite agency.
Okay.
We're 60 to 70 people. We have an annual budget of close to $300 million a year, maybe a little bit over every now and then. But I say we're small, but we're very potent. Libraries, of course, could use more funding. I'm never going to argue against that. But what we're doing the best we can with what we have. I should mention also that we have what is known as the Grants to States Division, which are each year there are federally funded block and formula grants to the state libraries. And each state library is free to do with that money what they will and divide it up how they will. So that's a very effective way of funding libraries. The division I work in is discretionary, where people are applying for competitive grants.
Okay. Well, let's shift this a little bit more about you, because I want to highlight you, the person. Let's talk about your personal leadership style and your approach to advocacy efforts when working in the community. So one of the things that we're focusing on here at Ready and Broadband.Money, and we both lead our community engagement strategy, is we actually talk to state broadband directors and other folks that typically have a lens towards infrastructure, but are looking to make local coordination, which is mandated in BEAD and digital equity as a part of how they should act in the community. What kind of meetings should they hold? How should they, arrange their, schedules, keeping in mind the residents and that we're targeting it through outreach efforts. So with your particular leadership style as a former librarian, now as a director of one of these, funder of these programs, how do you approach it?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, Scott. I come from a long line of Baptist ministers from South Carolina and Georgia, as well as public school educators.
That's a mix right there.
So that's very foundational in my own ministry, if I may use that word. I believe in service to the community. I was in the Peace Corps in Central Africa in the early 90s. But my leadership style is very much a networking style. I believe in what I call connecting the dots. And one of the things that I am able to take advantage of at IMLS is that I see what's taking place on a national scale. And there are many times when I've said, oh, X, Y, and Z is doing X, Y, and Z in Chicago. Did you know they're doing the same thing down in Durham? You guys should connect and compare notes. Another thing I really am a big believer in is what we've been talking about is digital inclusion and digital equity. As you know, I'm a big believer in the value of social media and messaging and connecting with folks online. And many times it can be a distraction or it can be an attention sucker. You have to know how to manage that affordance as well. But I cannot tell you how many times things I've discovered just by having to scroll through LinkedIn or seeing a tweet on Twitter. And I during the pandemic I spent a lot of time. I'm single and I live alone, so I spent a lot of time watching YouTube. And I would watch webinar after webinar after webinar on digital equity, digital inclusion, numerous topics. Some of my favorite authors, watching interviews and author events, but anything to stay connected. So I'm a big believer in the value of technology and online education, and that's my approach. And I could go analog as well. I still buy my books. I still get my Sunday Times, and I pick up the newspaper. But I like being informed, and I want to be knowledgeable and be able to share with folks. That's my style.
Shannon veges out a lot on the podcast. I don't think they're I don't think they're educational though.
They are.
Really? Okay.
Are you on TikTok?
I'm not. Okay. So I lurk. I'm a lurker on TikTok.
Same here.
I don't participate in the dance trends, but I'm so happy that
Ben
you're
is
here.
in the background laughing. I have no idea
Scott
what it
actually
is.
forbade me from making a TikTok.
Absolutely, I
Company.
am totally against some forms of social media,
But it's so important to stay up to speed on what's happening culturally
Absolutely.
with
Right.
these technological advances, and
Right.
social media is really the way that you.
I've learned a lot, and we'll talk about this in a few. I learned a lot just by following Mr. Neal. I
appreciate that.
Quality social media information, not trashy.
Scott is on Twitter.
I am on
I'm not.
Twitter.
So
I am
there
on
you go.
Twitter. All right. Let's talk about another personal connection we have, and that is dear old Morehouse College. I won't ask you what year you graduated, but we are both illustrious alumni of Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. Yeah, absolutely illustrious. Can you talk about that experience as we are in Black History Month? And I know you and I have talked about this. Black History is way more than a month, but can you talk about your Morehouse experience and how that impacted you and your work for what I like to call social activism or community education?
Yeah, Morehouse is very special, very important. I had the good fortune of having parents who went to HBCUs and having grandparents who went to HBCUs, which is, and even a great-grandparent who graduated from Benedict College in 1871, right after the Civil War in South Carolina. So the history runs deep. My grandfather taught at Morehouse. He was a professor of religion and philosophy. And my mom went to Spelman. So it was, nobody forced me to go to Morehouse. It was just...
It was in your blood. That was DNA.
It just happened. But I'm so glad that I remember freshman week just meeting all of these young Black men from all over the United States. Detroit, Chicago, D.C., New York, Philly. I was, first time I ever heard go-go, I was like, oh my God. So yeah, that part of the experience, like I'm misting up here thinking about it.
Best party I ever went to was a go-go party.
Okay.
Best part. I will never forget. It was part of freshman week.
Okay.
So Morehouse has this tradition that freshman week I don't know if they still do it. They still do it now.
They do. It's even more elaborate.
We dress up. You have to be in shirt and tie during freshman week orientation. You've got to dress up, and it is all about positive self-image, right?
Yes.
Because if you think about in a lot of the communities in which we come from, we don't really see a lot of Black men dressed up, unless, there are some, I'm generalizing. Mm-hmm. But to be on a campus and all of the freshmen, we all had white shirts and ties, and it was really about reinforcing that our history is more than just slavery and civil rights. You heard me say that before.
Yeah.
And another thing that was foundational, given today's debates about Black studies and African American studies, when I went to Morehouse and took my history classes as a part of the general curriculum, not only did you take Western civilization, you took African history as well.
Absolutely.
So I really, thank God that I was exposed to such deep and rich resources.
One of my foundational classes, I'll never forget this, Dr. Giles Conwell.
Okay.
He taught history of world civilization. And that I was captivated, because that was one of I come from educators too in my family, but that was the first time that I saw, the African diaspora and talking about, sort of all of the pre-history, the world history and improvements that African scholars, right, that the Greeks and some others stole from and never got the true credit for. And it really put in context that this whole notion that we're not being taught the full story. And I want to talk about, you brought it up, so I'm going to talk about it. Sort of this movement to ban, if you will, African American studies. You know, Shannon majored in African American studies.
Yes,
so we're
I was
talking,
an African American studies minor,
Very
and
good.
I went to a predominantly white institution though. So it's like if you go to a PWI, you have to be deliberate in making sure you get the curriculum and background in African American studies. Whereas at an HBCU, my husband also went to Morehouse. You get that foundationally, and you can bring it, and you're encouraged to bring it into your day-to-day life and your work and in your goals.
That's
and
great.
career.
So what do you, I know how you feel about it. So let's say, what can you say or can't say about this movement to curtail African American studies, this whole focus on CRT, which is a graduate and law school level focus. What do you think about that as a lifelong educator and learner?
You know, one of the two greatest enemies or nemesis that I have, ignorance and fear.
Oh wow!
And
how long you been in Washington D.C.?
Well, I grew up in South Carolina.
Okay, well,
I'm not gonna say too much about that.
Enough said.
But ignorance and fear are a part and parcel of what we're seeing. Also, there is a strong sense now of there are forces that are organized to foment and to suppress. But I do believe, like the Bible says, or the book says, truth crushed to the ground shall rise. I think those of us who are interested in the truth and suppression of, or fighting against suppression of certain communities, certain identities, certain histories, it's an ongoing effort. But it's also an interesting time because I now see the marshaling of forces who are definitely starting to talk back and offer some alternatives. And you're seeing it in libraries as well. There have been several libraries that are doing great things and great work with banned books and being sure that folks in their communities are getting access to books. But this is definitely a little bit different this time, and I'm cautiously optimistic for our future, but we have to be vigilant.
Yeah. I find it troubling that, and this has been a long view, but some people, they feel they can only win if others lose. And I think that's that's a totally ignorant and backward way to think. Right? I learned at a very early age that history is just a lens upon which we're viewing it from one view, his story, history, right? But there's still other lenses that don't take away from the shared experience, but it does create a different view of the same or similar event. And so why wouldn't you want to learn from various lenses to basically just to be a better person and to grow?
That's another thing, I'm going to mention South Carolina again, and one of the things I've struggled with my entire life is this country, its founding principles, all of the our core fundamental values speak to diversity, e pluribus unum, out of many one. But there is this need to continue to be divided, to continue to say we're us and them, othering others. We got to get beyond that because our success is bound in being together.
Absolutely.
And we cannot be divided.
Really, what you're doing with libraries, education is a huge part of the solution, right?
Yeah.
Because when we talk specifically about critical race theory, it's a lens. It's a way you analyze and interpret things that have happened in history. And if folks understood that, then maybe we would have less fear and ignorance, right? Understanding what it really means and what it really is.
Right.
To avoid making some mistakes that we made in the past.
Yeah.
Right. But,
Yeah.
All right, well, let's talk about our last segment. Let's lighten it up a little bit. You are probably, in my opinion, and I'm biased, most interesting people to follow on social media. Whether it's music, art, travel, food, museum, right? Learning about what's going on. How do you find time to manage it all?
Well, did I mention I was single?
Okay. All right. Yes, you did.
No, but I spent a lot of time online. You know what? There was a great tool that is now defunct that many people miss called Google Reader. And Google Reader was able to take an RSS feed from blogs, when blogs were a really big thing, and websites and just download it into a readable area. So now I use a thing called Feedly. Same idea, but it doesn't have the social function that the Google Reader had. But I spend about the first hour or two of my day on Feedly, and I have everything just divvied up: tech, design, food, African American culture, art, literature, and the like.
Write this down.
I'm taking this away.
So Feedly's pretty good.
Okay.
But then I also, I'll scroll through LinkedIn. I'll see what people are talking about. But I have eclectic interest. And
Absolutely.
I enjoy life,
Yep.
and I enjoy quality of life. So I'm trying to always get the best and the most I can out of the information that's out there. But I'm glad to know you're enjoying it. I also enjoy your presence. You've been a role model for me.
Thank you.
Especially what you got going on here. This is awesome.
I'm trying to branch out. I'm focused on broadband a lot and,
Right.
and local communities, but
Right.
I learn more about your travels and food and family when you're checking on your mom. And,
Right.
Yeah. I'm really invested in sort of your journey.
Well, I appreciate
But I'm
that.
also learning. I think that's the most important thing.
I appreciate that stuff.
I learned something about the jazz age. For y'all out here, follow James Neal. It's not pop culture. It's really about education. It's really about the foundational elements of education from a lot of different lenses, right? So I'm gonna plug it because I sit down in the morning and I have my coffee, and I always see what James is talking about.
I appreciate you. I hope you follow some other folks too.
Well, I'm working on it. I follow some people. Shannon probably follows like Rihanna. And
Excuse me.
Beyonce.
I
Beyonce.
have a diversity of interests as well. I do the late night scrolling at night when I should be going to bed,
Right.
and instead. But
I had to stop that.
Feedly,
I
that is,
see.
yeah, it's not good because the blue light keeps you up late and it
Right.
affects your sleep quality. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I'm glad
it's
you
a better
mentioned the jazz too, Scott. I mean, if anything in my life that I just truly wish I could do more of is listen to live jazz. I was in New Orleans, a couple of weeks ago, and went to Preservation Hall, and just heard some traditional New Orleans jazz, and I was literally in tears at the end of that night. It was amazing.
I wish I could transport back in time when Miles Davis and John Coltrane played together.
Yeah.
At I think it's the Capitol Blue Note year. See now that the young folks want to turn away.
I'm waiting for him
Ben
to mention Beyonce. Like it's not.
No,
we're not in
Beyonce
that
is
era.
not. She might sample Miles Davis, but she's
Have
not.
you checked out Samara Joy?
No.
She's the young woman that won the Grammy recently for Best Jazz Album.
Oh,
She's
okay.
amazing.
I'm gonna look her up.
Yeah,
for sure.
Samara Joy.
Don't judge me.
No, it's all good.
Audience
We're talking to
members, don't
Jen.
judge me.
Yeah, we're talking to Ben too. Ben.
I
Ben
want to
doesn't
know about any like live jazz spots in DC.
DC, the most live jazz that I go see is usually at the Kennedy Center.
Okay.
There are a few jazz clubs, including Blues Alley,
Hamilton Live.
Hamilton Live. Hamilton Live is a good space. But yeah, most of the time I'm going to Kennedy Center, and I go to New York
A lot.
Yeah.
Because I read about it.
We got a pretty good sampling when we were driving through Mississippi.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, we did. I
That
had
was
to.
pretty
I had to educate those in the car with me. We were
The
listening to
roots.
blues. No, we
Right.
were listening to blues,
Right.
and a lot of blues artists
Right.
come from Mississippi,
Right.
and we had to educate the young folks on
That's great.
on blues. And I grew up in a musical household.
Where are
so-
you from originally?
Detroit.
Oh,
From
that's right.
Detroit,
That's
Michigan.
right.
So I grew up on Bobby Blue Bland and
And you say you're not
B.B.
Cass Tech,
King.
right?
I am not Cass Tech. I am not Cass
Because
Tech.
when I went to
What is
Morehouse,
Cass Tech?
Cass Tech
Cass
was a
Tech
major
was
high
the
school.
Oh,
Preeminent, well, I'm not going to say it was known as the preeminent technical advanced placement high school in Detroit.
Gotcha.
Has that
and
changed?
Renaissance. I think it still is, right?
You
I
went to
went to, I
Renaissance?
did not.
Oh,
I
really?
went to Frank Cody High School. Actually turned down an opportunity to go to Cass
Okay.
because I wanted to be dumb and play basketball
Ah.
and not go to Cass. But that's a whole nother
So
story.
is
That's
Frank
another-
Cody in Detroit proper?
It is Detroit proper.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. In the
Is it like a magnet high school?
No, it's not.
It's not. Well, that.
I did. I
What is
went
that?
to.
I went to a
no,
magnet
because
high
I
school
went
in
to Ann
Jersey
Arbor
City.
Trail. Ann Arbor Trail Middle School was the magnet middle school
Okay.
in Detroit, and
Okay.
many of the students that go to Ann Arbor Trail go to Cass or Renaissance.
Gotcha.
But I,
So how long did you play?
till I got hurt. So I played 3 years, and I broke my foot, and
Okay.
I played a couple different sports, and
Okay.
but coming from a family of educators, education was always
The thing.
the thing. So that's what led me to Morehouse. My dream was to play basketball at University of Michigan.
Okay.
And now his son is a Harvard student.
Is he
I'm
playing
gonna
ball?
brag about that.
Plays football for Harvard.
Oh, really?
Yeah, my
Awesome.
oldest does.
Awesome.
So yeah, you had to throw Harvard in there.
Yeah, hey.
Every
Graduate
episode.
of every
Right.
episode.
Very
we
top.
might just have a Harvard episode.
9 out of 10.
segment.
We
Nine
had
out of 10.
we had NIST in here earlier. We
We
have
get
that thrown
NIST in Harvard. Well,
And that's it.
so Jason, I want to give you the last word. So what is your call to action? You have a very impressive career. I am so glad that you're here. What is your call to action as we are moving from the mapping into the actual implementation of IIJA, focusing on BEAD and digital equity? What is your call to action, not just to people that you are involved with, but to the community as a whole?
Yeah, I think it points towards what I heard from Alan Davidson from NTIA. He talked. I've seen him several times and actually had a conversation with him after the Shelby conference that took place in October. And what I mentioned earlier, I don't want to wake up 3 to 5 years from now and we're still talking about this stuff.
Yeah.
I want to see signs of progress, milestones, performance measurement, accountability, assessment. How do we make this stuff last and sustain? Because the money will eventually not be there, and we'll have to come up with new resources and new ways of thinking about how we approach the quote-unquote digital divide. From the perspective of libraries, I will again emphasize that digital literacy and digital skills training for librarians as well as members of their communities is going to be ongoing work for my agency and should be ongoing work for any community or educational organization that is interested in how digital equity is achieved. All right?
That's the word to end
Yes.
on. You can
Okay,
plug
well-
where we can find you. How can we follow you on Twitter? If you can give us your Twitter and IMLS, if you can
Okay.
give us your
Yep.
government agency and address.
All right, so I'm James Neal from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. You can find me online at James, the number 3, Neal, at twitter.com. Also on Instagram. The agency I work for is the Institute of Museum and Library Services, also known as the IMLS. There's a website, www.imls.gov.
All right.
All
Excellent.
right.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. That's all the time we have for today. So on behalf of the Radio Not Podcast, Scott Woods here, Shannon Williams Mitchum, we are so glad that you stopped by today.
Thank you.
And thank you very much. And I tell everyone, as I always do, be well and Godspeed. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Bye.
One take, baby.